Hi Chris, yeah, nice to see you again.
Likewise.
I'll just go around and sort of do the intros before we start the podcast. My name is Michael, and I'm presenting alongside Mitch the Mental Injustice podcast on behalf of Unlock My Life. Mitch, I'll let you intro you.
I'm Mitch, work with Unlock My Life, and I am an well, I'll never say ex, I'm an IPP prisoner who's recently been released and working with the team going forward.
And Chris, I'll let you give your own intro.
Well, my name's Chris Daw. I'm a KC barrister and a long-time criminal lawyer for 30 years now. Also writer of books about crime and punishment, and maker occasionally of TV shows on the same topic. So basically someone who's very, very interested in criminal justice policy, and basically all the monumental fuck-ups that we make about it nearly every day.
Yeah, that sums it up nicely. First of all, I suppose the reason I got here is a little plug for your book. Was that book I stumbled across from joining Unlock My Life, really, and getting more into, always been an advocate, still serving prisoner, so I'm quite into it anyway. But yeah, stumbled across your book, stumbled across you, and you generously agreed to give us some of your time. So I suppose we'll just get straight into it, Chris.
Sure.
I suppose the first one would be, why the book? Why Justice on Trial, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, like a lot of people, I suppose, particularly lawyers, I kind of just did the job for many, many years. I started out as, I qualified as a barrister when I was 23, and I started out in Manchester doing, burglary cases and assaults, affrays, kind of lower level stuff, magistrates court stuff. And then basically I spent sort of 10, 15 years just getting more serious cases, but just flat out, like constantly working, constantly moving one case to another, going to prison. Sometimes I'd be in a prison in the morning. I'd see 2-3 clients in, say strange ways in the morning, and then I'd be in court all day, and then I'd have more clients to see. And it was just a non-stop kind of, almost like a bit of a hamster's wheel kind of existence, really, but really, really, really interesting, really exciting. And I hope kind of helped some people along the way. But then about 10 years or so ago, I became what was then a QC, or now a KC, sort of very senior barrister. And I had a bit more time to think, and I just began to sort of ask myself, okay, I know why, I sort of think I know why I go to work, and I know exactly what I do every day. But what I don't know is why we're doing it. Why is the system the way it is? Why is the whole process essentially a bit of a sausage factory of taking young people, often from the care system or from sort of dysfunctional or other forms of sort of backgrounds that are kind of not giving them the kind of upbringing that really gives them a good start in life. And as soon as they make a single mistake, even as a 10 or 11-year-old, they end up in a police station, then they end up in the youth courts, and they end up in young offenders institutions. And before you know it, they're 25 or 30, and they've been behind the door for 6, 7, 8 years of their 20s. And I thought, this can't be right. It's not working for anyone. It's not working for the people who are in the system. It's not working for those who end up inside, and it's not working for the rest of us, or the people on the outside, because it's not actually reducing crime. It's not making society a better place. So I started asking myself all these sorts of questions, and began to do some research about other places where they do things differently in criminal justice that kind of is a bit more of a sane and fair system. And then in the end, I started writing some articles for the newspapers and magazines, and then I was approached by my publisher, Bloomsbury, who also published Harry Potter, by the way. So sadly, I haven't sold quite as many copies, but
Not yet.
We'll get there. But anyway, I don't think they're going to make 8 movies out of my book either. But anyway, so basically they asked me, would I be interested in writing a book? And I said, yeah, I would actually. And now you mention it. And so we spent a bit of time going backwards and forwards. And within a few months, I was at work on Justice on Trial. And, and it's thankfully been quite well received. I'm not sure that the powers that be in government are listening much, but lots of other people out there seem to think that we've hit on some good ideas.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the whole people in government, they've not been listening for a long time.
No, well, that is true. Sadly,
that kind of leads me, I suppose, naturally onto why. And I suppose in your chapter 2 specifically, you talk about, the times or periodic get tough approaches, which I personally think we're in one now, being in prison.
Yeah, we are.
Listening to what's going on. They're talking about 2/3, implementing 2/3 of sentences, which I personally, maybe I'm biased, but don't seem them worthy. Someone that used to sell drugs needs to do 2/3 in order to be reformed. It's you talk about it being beloved of politicians and the legislation, and I just want to know why does this approach not work, and why is it consistently, I would say, almost used and abused and manipulated, I would suggest, by politicians to like manipulate public perception?
I think because it's, relatively speaking, when politicians like really simple messages, and they like messages that are difficult to argue with, and arguing that criminal justice policy is wrong and arguing that long sentences don't help society, it's quite difficult to do that in 1 or 2 words. Whereas you can talk about cracking down or getting tough, and that's really easy for people to get their heads around. And generally speaking, I think out there, people I don't think have ever been fully educated about what it means when you do those things. So we had the last election, we had Boris Johnson at the time still around, standing for election as leader of the Conservatives and as Prime Minister, and Priti Patel, who was the Home Secretary. And they went all over the country saying, it's time to get tough on criminals. We need to build more prisons. We need longer sentences. All of those things, people instinctively, I think, on average, react quite positively. Why won't we want our politicians to get tough on criminals? But what they don't, there's none of the evidence as part of that. And I think the problem is it's just too easy for politicians to go out there and win hearts and minds using that quite emotional appeal to people's kind of anger and also to people's, sympathies, because, who isn't sympathetic to, the family of someone who's been murdered or a woman who's been raped. Lots of people are obviously naturally very sympathetic. But the problem is that sympathy doesn't necessarily translate into good policy. And because policy, for me, should be about making a difference, making a change, making things better. And the politicians, I'm afraid, are just, they trot out the same old messages about getting tough and building more prisons. And, you hear it, don't you? And then, politicians say, well, we haven't got enough prison places. Well, we need to build more then. Instead of saying, why is that a target for society to have more prisons and more people in prison? You would have thought that would be the opposite of the direction that society would want to go, because surely the more prisoners you have, the more you've failed. Your system has failed if you have to keep building more and more prisons. It means that whatever you're doing didn't work and isn't working, as they found out in America, where there's, better than I do, they have 2.5 million people in prison. Is that a symbol of success in criminal justice and policy? It's difficult to see how it is. So I think the short answer to your question is politicians like to get votes, otherwise they don't get power, and talking tough on crime gets votes. It's as simple as that.
I think it's a selfish political agendas, I suppose. It's selfish, but then I suppose politicians, in a sense, they have to be selfish in the sense that unless you get elected, you can't really do anything. And so I have some sympathy. Of course, you've got to have popular messaging and that kind of thing. But the problem is that when winning votes comes at the cost to society of more misery and more crime, I think really we need to have a bit of a stock take on why is it that people, the average voter, responds so well, so consistently to messages about increasing sentences, cracking down on crime and cracking down on criminals, and doesn't seem to have any sort of insight or interest in an alternative kind of way of doing things that might actually mean fewer victims of crime and fewer people in prison, which surely in the end is what we all want. Yeah, 100%.
Chappie.
Yeah, mate.
Back of what Chris said, the word jumps out to me, understanding. Would you agree that society doesn't really understand the complexities of prisoners' lives, and more so the prison system and what it involves when they send someone to jail? I think, like reading Chris's book, the lack of understanding within society, it jumps out at me.
Well, Mitch, why don't you explain it a bit? So if we've got listeners or people watching that don't understand day to day, just give a little description, I suppose, of what we go through, what other people go through. What does it look like in prison?
Where
Um,
did it start for you? I think it'd be interesting to understand
Yeah.
how your journey into that sort of lifestyle and repeat prison sentences. You know, at what age did that start for you? Because I think that's really important that people understand how that works.
yeah. I'm an example of, I can't hit a figure. The numerous people in BCAT locals are CCATs. For our listeners, BCAT locals are where you go, where you first get remanded, and if you're on a short sentence, you stay there. CCAT are where you go if you've got a reasonable sentence, 4 years up to about 10, and you do your sentence there. But I was, like many, went to jail when I was 15, and it became a continuous cycle, and the whole politician rhetoric of send them to jail and it will be a shock, but that's for a select few. The unfortunate thing what's going on is it's people are a product of their environment. So if you put them into a prison system, there's an old saying, it's the university of crime. If they've not got family support, they've got mental health issues, what's happening is a continuous cycle of people that start at 15, carry on committing crime because of their life circumstances, or they haven't got the opportunity, or let's be honest, they don't want to. They soon become 30, 40. There's a bit in Chris's book where he describes an inmate who's spent his 50, the majority of life he's spent in prison. And what I mean with understanding, society's understanding, is the things like, if someone spent that long in prison, they get out to, as Chris said in his book, it's like awaking from a coma. You've got your family's gone, your friends, your support network's gone after doing such a long time in prison. You get released with enough food for, enough money for a few days. You're in a hostel, and you're in a society that some people can't cope with, or they need big support to adapt to. These are the things that are going on daily, day to day, and a repeat over the years. But does society truly understand about that kind of stuff? And it was so enlightening to hear someone like Chris, what I consider approaching a taboo subject, because like we all know, politicians don't want to talk about poor inmates, etc., because it doesn't sell, it doesn't get votes. But society's understanding is lacking, I would say.
Can I ask you something? Because I think you've summarised the problem really well there, or the issues really well. But I'm really interested in this. So you're 15. I presume that, but when you went to your young offenders institution when you were 15, I presume you'd already been arrested before that for other stuff. There'd been all the other kind of like supervision orders or whatever along the way, all of that stuff. What was it? I mean, why didn't any of that work? Why didn't, you know, for example, when you first get arrested and you first end up in the youth court, what happened, and why did it really, if anything, it seems to have made things worse for you rather than made it less likely that you'd get involved in more trouble? I think most people will just not be able to understand why whatever we're doing to 12, 13, 14-year-olds who first get into trouble, why that is actually within a year or two, you're in effectively, I mean, because young offenders institutions are basically prisons. I mean, you know, they call them something different, but they're basically a prison. So, but why? What do you think was the reason? I mean, how old were you when you were first arrested?
So a quick brief. My mum was very supportive, sent me to a good school, even though we lived on what you'd consider a rough estate. Tried her best. As a lot of young men, I wanted to emulate what I considered to be cool. So started hanging around with older boys, then started committing crime. That was what was going on around me, even though I went to a good school. So that got worse and worse.
How old were you at this point? What are we talking?
13 is when I kind of broke the reins from being good at school to, right, I don't go to school, I'm on the roads. So in petty shoplifting with the older lot. So instead of petty shoplifting, it then became burglaries. And that's been the story for me, story for numerous people. Your crimes escalate. And you become, looking back on it with hindsight, you become hardened. It's not that you don't care, but it's when you continuously do something, it's in you to kind of block things out. So of course you care about victims, but if you can't block it out, you wouldn't do it. So you become hardened, and it becomes almost entrenched in you to commit crime, not care about the consequences. But looking back at myself at 15, it was so I went to prison at 15. Was scared. Wales was a wild place then, and I believe it's even wilder now. But on the flip side, it's you've gone from society living like that to a place where your friends are, and you realize that it's not that as bad as you thought, and you can get on with it. And if you've not got the support system and I can't think of the word, but if it's not a short, sharp shock to you, the repeat cycle starts. And that repeat cycle, once you start and you go back more than once, very hard to get off. As you can probably state that the people in the prison system that have been there more than once outweigh the people that have only been once and never go. It's just so you become stuck in this cycle of crime, getting out, you've missed out. Crime does pay and it doesn't pay. If you were to get out as a young man and have to start from scratch, and those options are limited, it's so easy to revert back to what you know.
Well, I tell you, it's a very interesting point, because the thing that I've really been passionate about, and one of the chapters in the book, is why children should never be treated as criminals. In other words, I don't think anyone should have a criminal record before they're 18. It doesn't mean that if people get into trouble that there aren't consequences of some kind, but they need to be focused on the welfare of the young person rather than focused on punishing them and sending them down. Because for me, I genuinely can't imagine how you hit your 18th birthday, you've already been inside for however long, you've already got, I don't know how many convictions for I don't know how many things. How do you ever start your adult life and think, you know what, I'm going to turn over a new leaf, I'm an adult now, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to go to university? Is it even possible to do that when you've got all of that history and all of that back, even if you wanted to, and even if you had people around you saying, okay, I'm going to help you and encourage you? Is it basically, by the time you've reached that point, after all of the experiences you've described, is it kind of effectively, it's almost hopeless? Like, what am I going to do? How can I get away from this?
Unfortunately, that's true. And this is what I talk about, understanding in society. Then you've made a mistake, maybe two, as a young adult. But then I remember it, and it's only you speaking to you that's made me remember. Getting out at about 19 of my second sentence and feeling like, well, I can't do anything else. I still had my mum and good support, but they're only good for a certain amount of support. Actually going into society and getting a job, not only do you feel not confident in doing it, you can have all the will in the world, but you've still got a criminal record, and a serious criminal record, even at that age. You are hindered, and that's not to say like they shouldn't have criminal records. No one's advocating that, but there was no real support when I got out when I was a teenager, because you don't fit into the whole yacht schemes. Yacht is young offenders treatment or something. So you're on probation, but the same back then is the same now. Probation are there to monitor risk. If you're not an imminent risk, we can't really help you, because the caseloads, we've got 80 young offenders, 80 prisoners, high risk, whatever, and we're overworked. So society's understanding of, well, they get all this support and these courses in prison. My not argument, my fact is, are those courses relevant in society? I got out of.
What qualification did you have at the age of 18?
I think we did like basic. It was either plumbing or carpentry, but it's so low level that unless someone gave you an apprenticeship, you're pissing in the wind. And I'll finish on. I got out of an IPP, as Chappie knows. I did all the courses going, both psychologically and everything vocational. And this isn't an excuse. I should have stuck to it and been determined. But the prison system sold these courses like they're a fix to everything. And then once you've done the courses, you're okay. No support mental health wise. I've seen like you, Chris. When you probably started and when I started my prison journey, mental health within prisons was deemed like, well, you either go to a madhouse or you go to prison. There was no in between. And the prison system was full of people with mental health issues. It's still the same 25, 30 years on. And they're letting all these fake qualifications and you've done Kaizen, you're fixed. But in the real world, those mental health issues and that feeling of I'm so behind is you get let out and it's all fake, to be honest. It's all fake. I'm not saying that people can take things from them like I have now, but the majority is bothered about what it looks like in public perception. We've done this course. We do. Half of them are proved not to work.
Yeah, well, I mean, very famously, of course, the sex offenders course was discredited. They spent hundreds of millions on it, and it turned out that the people who did the course reoffended more than the people who didn't, which is, you know, not exactly a great mark of success. But do you know what? One of the things that I talk about in the book, and I think it's really interesting, kind of coming off the back of what you've just said, is my view of one of the reasons why prison is so unsuccessful is because it's so unlike living in the real world. It is so different to the real world that it's so difficult for someone, particularly someone who spent quite a long time in a prison or custodial environment, you know, just living in society, like you talked about, as I said in the book, about, you know, in the case of someone who's done 10 or 15 or 18 years, you know, behind the door, then literally they're coming out. It's like life on Mars. You know, the world's a completely different world, not even the same sort of place. And the people have got these things in their hands, and what are they? And, you know, all of that kind of thing. And I've always thought that the major reason why prison fails so badly is because we make prison so different to the way that we live on the outside. And I did a lot of work and I've written a bit in the book about the way in which they operate prisons, for example, in Norway, which is a country, you know, it's a wealthy country, it's a wealthy, advanced country like us, but it's a country that has very few people in prison. But those people who are in prison are almost all violent offenders. So they have almost nobody gets into prison for sort of non-violent stuff in Norway. But the prisons are not really like prisons at all. The only thing that they share in common with a prison as we would know it is they have perimeter security. So people can't just come and go, obviously, particularly if they're in for murder or something like that. But once you get within the perimeter, it's housing units that are pretty much like apartments. People live together, they cook together in their own kitchens. You don't have this sort of mass catering, this whole idea that you're in an institution, which of course prisons are institutions. And unsurprisingly, if you institutionalize people, they become institutionalized. Whereas if the prison environment is still secure for the people who need secure conditions, but you actually just live, you know, you go out to work, you come back again. Like I say, you can even in some of the prisons there, you can have family stay for the weekend. And, you know, you can have a meal together, you can cook for your family, that kind of thing, which is all the sorts of things that are completely taken away from you in our prison system. You have none of that normality, no family life, nothing. I mean, even the visits are, to me, are an inhumane way of doing it. You know, even babies' nappies being searched and stuff like that. I get the need for some of that. Of course, I get the security issues, but you have to, at some point, don't you, say to yourself, well, isn't it more important to think about when people who have been in prison, when they come out, when they're released, more than treating them as sort of in this heavily institutionalized and heavily regimented way whilst they're in custody, because the two things are in conflict. You can't treat people like that and have institutions and expect them then to go and live in a flat, get a job, go to work, get on the tube, do all the things that actually are life skills that you only kind of get when you do it. And if you've had 5 or 10 years out of circulation, I would imagine that those sorts of life skills are extremely scary. And that's setting aside the fact that, as you pointed out, you apply for a job, it says, have you got a criminal record? You know, so you're kind of, the minute you apply for a job, if it asks if you've got convictions, if you have to say yes, if it's not spent, you know, nine times out of 10, you're not going to get the job anyway. So the whole thing seems to be stacked against giving people a chance when they get out, and you give people a chance, as a few employers do in this country, Timpson's famously, but a number of other sort of corporations that are willing to kind of take people even when they've just come out of jail. But if you give people a chance to work, I think most people, given all of the right ingredients, housing, you know, training, education, a sort of socialization, you know, a network of friends, family around them, who are not just people who have just come out of prison as well. I think most people actually would go eventually in the right direction. It's just that we don't give anybody a chance. And the chance is taken away from, as you said, as young as 12 or 13 years of age, when you're immediately treated by the police and by the courts as being a criminal. And I don't buy the idea that 13-year-olds and 14, you can do bad things, of course, but it doesn't mean that you're that way forever. And yet we make people that way forever. That's what I think is our biggest mistake.
I think, sorry, on that is the bit you said about giving people opportunity. The amount of youngsters I see come through the prison system, 16 to, so let's say 21, 22, that don't know any different. I grew up on a council estate. I was in a children's home. As it happens, I actually went out to work and I did have opportunities. So I'm not going to sit here and blame anyone, but I could definitely have made the right decisions. However, there's a very high percentage of people I've seen in the system that have never worked, never known work. Parents have never worked, family have never worked. They've grown up in an estate, and people miraculously want them to all of a sudden go into a working environment and say, well, why don't you go and get a job? Like, working in Greggs, and no disrespect to anyone in those lower paid jobs, isn't everyone's idea of making it, you know? And a lot of young people have aspirations and they want more for themselves. And when you grow up on a council estate, especially, you want those things even more, because you can only see them as a vision. You can only see them on social media, or you see people living this life. So how else are you meant to get it apart from what you know? You only know what you know. So if you only see drug dealing and robberies, and how as a 15-year-old, 17-year-old, are you then meant to be like, well, you should go and work in a corporate world or go and work in a city? You don't know what the city is at this point.
No, this is a really good point you're making here, because when I go around speaking at schools, as I do, in communities like of the kind that you're talking about, where there is an awful lot of unemployment and generational unemployment, you know, where, as you described, you know, parents and even grandparents. I spoke at a school where they said lots of the kids, their parents and grandparents have never had a job, and many of them have been in and out of jail, and obviously and all the rest of it. And one of the biggest challenges is that when I go and speak in these schools, is that when I talk about careers, and I try and speak in a way that's kind of obviously, I don't come in there and say, right, all of you are going to be barristers, because I mean, not that everyone want to be barristers anyway, but you know, it's not about being a barrister or being anything else. It's about, you know, them actually believing, these kids, that there is a legitimate path to success in life of any kind. It doesn't matter what it is. It might be start their own business, it might be whatever, but they just don't have any role modeling around that, and they just don't believe it. They just don't believe it happens to people like them in their communities. And it's that lack of sort of ambition, that lack of experience of, you know, what's out there and what can be achieved, and lack of role models. So one of the sort of really difficult things for me is, you know, many of my clients over the years, I would say 97% of my clients have been male, as it happens. I mean, I've had a small number of women clients over the years, but most clients in the system, as you know, are male, and they started as young men in the system. And I would say that there is that, you know, one of the things that we've got to grapple with is that you often find that those in the system have either been in care, so they had no sort of direct parental involvement, or they only have a mother around and they don't have a father around and may not have even met or seen their father. And so you've got very few that have the sort of a balanced kind of role modeling around, you know, one or both parents working, both parents giving them equal support. I'm saying that's essential, of course, but I think it's a feature that we've got to grapple with, is what do we do about the fact that, as you've described, the role models that there are the lads who have, you know, sold a bit of gear, they've got nice watches, they may be driving around in the Audis and the BMs, and, you know, there's no one else around that looks like they're doing anything with their life except them. But I mean, what's the answer? How do you grapple with those realities? Because I think role modeling for young people and young men in particular, and it's not even a race thing, because, you know, there's a lot of young white men out there who are, you know, who are in exactly the same straits, and you see them inside as well. It's not, you know, this, to me,
Economics.
it's a very difficult thing to grapple with. But I think ultimately what we end up with at the moment is that the minute someone breaks the law, in the sense of, like you say, initially a bit of shoplifting or whatever it might be, the minute they get arrested, they just become designated as a criminal. And that's what they believe about themselves, you know. And if what you believe about yourself is where you're going to end up on the whole, I mean, that's the truth of it. And we're imprinting this idea, and the media keeps perpetuating this idea. You know, you see it all the time. We had it yesterday. You know, the judge will release the identity of a 14 or 15-year-old who's got done for murder. So they don't even get anonymity as a child anymore, because judges will allow their names to be all over the papers. And what happens is that the media just say, this is terrible, evil, monster kid that's just a terrible, nasty person. That underneath all of that, and underneath what they did, most of the kids that I've seen over many, many years going through the system, whether they be young kids or whether they started as young kids and they've grown into adult sort of offenders, they're damaged individuals with lots and lots of kind of underlying issues which have never been addressed, often mental health, often abuse themselves, often witnessing domestic violence in their own home or in the community, and these kinds of things. You can't just magic all that away and tell people to go and get a job. You've got to deal with the whole picture, and I think that's sadly something we're not seeing any evidence of in policy.
I suppose, what would you then say, Chris, to people that would don't agree with the rehabilitative philosophy, and, you know, they think it's inconsistent and it's unfair? And well, I speak to so many people, and I hear it. You even hear it in the prison system with officers, and give you examples like, even when you go to DCAT, the job opportunities are working in factories, going to work for a charity. There's no real substance. And going back to what you were saying, Mitch, earlier about, you know, you do all these tick box exercises, courses, and so you're leaving there with nothing. What do you say to those people that were like, well, that's your problem, that's their problem, it's our choice to go and commit crime?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, there's a misunderstanding about choice, because a choice is something that you make. Let's, for example, at the age of 18, if every child in this country had the same opportunities, education, the same parental support, the same access to sports facilities, and all the other stuff that goes with, you know, middle class kind of family life, if you like, all of those kind of advantages and opportunities. If every single child had all the same things exactly until they're 18. We start with a level playing field at 18, then there'd be an argument, okay? But the truth is that so many young people, their lives are marked by trauma, parental addiction, parental criminality, parental violence or domestic violence, you know, a lack of support or lack of any family environment at all, and the care system. That you can't blame, in the sense of sort of putting some sort of moral retribution against people who were never given a chance, who never had a chance in the first place. So what I say is, okay, if someone who has that point of view can honestly say they went through all of those same experiences and came out the other side, good on you, but you are a very, very unusual individual, because most people are impacted in a negative way by negative childhood experience and by childhood traumas of the kind that most people in the prison system have experienced in one way or another. But perhaps set aside all of that. It doesn't really matter whether people like, dislike, or have a view about the individuals we're talking about. What matters more importantly to me is the argument that I've tried to make is not feel sorry for people because of whatever their history may be and why they've ended up in trouble. You know, if you don't feel sorry for people, you don't feel that's your prerogative. My argument is, how do you think we can change the way we do things so that there are fewer people who commit crime in the future? And most importantly of all, when you're making this argument out there, so that there are fewer victims of crime.
100%.
Because the two things go hand in hand. The more you can support people who have got involved in the criminal justice system to get out of the criminal justice system, the fewer the people who are going to get burgled or robbed or stabbed in the future. And that's where I think people have got a disjointed mindset, because the belief that you just keep ever punishing people and locking them up even more as the solution, when you analyze it, what that leads to as night follows day is in 5 or 7 or 10 years, you're going to have a lot more violent crime, because the people that you would have locked up for, say, 4 years, you're going to lock them up for 8 or 12. Well, you're just going up with 200, 300,000 people in prison, and they're all going to come out at some point after even longer in prison, and you're going to have a crime wave on your hands, because these people are never going to get a job. You know, if you're locking up so many people for decades, the chances of getting out of prison after 10 or 12 or 15 years and getting into long-term paid employment that will support you for the rest of your life are almost nil. And until we recognize that that what we're doing is making it worse, we're going to keep making the same mistakes. So you're right to raise it. You know, I hear it all the time. So why should these people get special treatment coming out of prison when there's homeless people who haven't done anything wrong? The two wrongs don't make a right. The fact that we don't adequately provide for the homeless in this country, or we don't adequately provide employment for many people in society, doesn't mean that we should withdraw those things, homes and jobs, from people coming out of prison as well. I mean, you're just doubling the problem rather than looking to reduce the problem across society. And I think it's all too easy. I mean, you mentioned social media, and one of the problems we live in an age now, not just of social media, but the sheer number of news channels and radio stations, which basically only survive because they wind people up, because they get people really angry about stuff. And that is really dangerous, because it means that public opinion isn't getting the benefit of a sort of balanced perspective on stuff. Public opinion is being forced in the sort of American direction of ever increasing sentences by just anger. And anger does sell. It sells newspapers, it sells, it gets people listening to radio stations, which drives advertising revenue. So really we're drifting in a direction, which I think you guys will have seen with your experiences over the years, where you've just got more entrenched criminality and you've got less opportunity to get out of the system, and that is just fundamentally where we're going wrong.
Chappie,
go on.
This is why I found this book, Chris's book, so insightful. Like I mentioned the word taboo, and I was worried about using it, but it is a taboo subject. Nobody's sitting here, me and you, I can speak for you, Chappie.
Yeah, 100%.
We're not shouldn't be punished, because we would live in a lawless society where it's the Wild West. If someone committed a crime against my family, I would want them to be punished. But I think that Chris's book, why I say it's a taboo subject, what do we do with these people? Because the majority of prisoners are going to get released, and they're going to get released with the same mindset or the same issues that they went to prison with. And this is what I mean about the repeat cycle. And it's that question: what do we do to help prisoners? Because I'm very much I can understand anybody saying, well, he's committed a crime and then he gets to do all these relevant courses that are going to put him in a better position than Joe Bloggs is. But two wrongs don't make a right. Do you want that person, A, committing crime, creating more victims, or being a productive member of society? And the prison system at the does not do that.
No, it doesn't. And I think one of the things that I think people misunderstand about the prison environment, and you know, I've represented hundreds, probably thousands of people over the years. And I would say that if you look at the spectrum of the people I've represented in terms of intelligence, in terms of abilities, it's no different to the spectrum I've met in in any other walk of life, in the rest of my life. In other words, you've got people who are thick in prison, you've got people who are thick on the outside, but you've also got people incredibly intelligent and could easily qualify and do, you know, any number of degrees, PhDs, trained to be computer scientists, or any of the jobs that are out there. But the prison system effectively treats everyone as being kind of, you know, a bit average. And that's often, of course, because many in prison have dropped out of school, so they maybe don't have GCSEs in basic subjects, that kind of thing. But instead of saying, okay, let's just effectively, if you've had a young person, particularly if they're doing a long sentence. I mean, you know, there are many people, as you know now, doing long sentences in their late teens, early 20s, are getting, you know, long sentences where they're doing 15s and 20s, and, you know, particularly in drugs conspiracies, they're going to be in for a very long time. Okay, if someone you know, you've got them for 10 years, let's say, or 8 years, or whatever it is, that's a long time. I mean, that's a very long time. And if you think about it, that's from 8 years old to 16, that's 8 years. And from an 8-year-old to 16, the child has gone through so many different kinds of education and have ended up doing GCSEs after that 8-year period. What we really need to do is we need to be saying every day we should be looking to catch up and make up for the stuff that they missed. So that instead of just, like you say, woodwork or plumbing or whatever it might be, which is all very well, but if you've got 10% of the prison population are actually capable, that if it wasn't for their record, they could be doctors or scientists or anything else because they're really clever, then you don't train those people to do a job that they're way too clever for. And you've got to try and make the education and the training fit the individuals, because otherwise the cleverest people in prisons, and often in my experience they've been drug dealers and people, you know, because it's a business, you know. Drug dealing is a real business that involves, you know, logistics, it involves finances, it involves all the things to run any other business. So many of the people I've met over the years in the drug trade have been, you know, really clever people who could equally run a legitimate business. But if you don't set the people up who are in prison to actually make the most of their individual talents, and you try and dumb everyone down to a kind of average level that doesn't engage the more intelligent people, some people are maybe not even capable of getting that level, the whole system, unfortunately, is utterly counterproductive. And you just end up with frustrations and anger, and you get people coming out, you know, with absolutely no hope and prospect. So I think absolutely the focus needs to be on how do you get people when they leave prison to make sure that they have the maximum level of skills and qualifications that they could possibly have in the time that they're in there, so that they are the best at trained that they could be. Also, very important to start the work integration process. As you say, some of the jobs working out are not jobs that, you know, the really highly intelligent people, you know, they're working out doing jobs that really they're too good to do. They need to be working out doing jobs that are actually really reflective of the talents that they've got and the abilities. So you've got to look to try and place people into jobs that, because no one's going to end up, a really clever person who may have had, you know, made quite a lot of money in the drug trade before they went into prison, they're not going to come out and settle, like you say, for working in Greggs. They're just not going to happen. Even there's nothing wrong with working in Greggs, and there's a temporary thing, maybe people being released without qualifications for a year or two. You're going to have to do low-level jobs. That's kind of the way that it sometimes works. But you've got to make people, you've got to say to people, we're not saying to you the limit of what you're going to achieve in the straight world is working in McDonald's. The limit is going to be, you could be a Formula One engineer or an airline pilot or whatever it might be. The limit is the same limit as anybody else. But we've got to give you the opportunities and the tools to actually get you back on track, because you've lost so many years where your education didn't happen and it was destroyed by circumstance or being in custody. So I think focusing on individualized education plans for every single person, you know, I don't know to the extent that they even do IQ testing and work out, you know, because it's all, yes, just because most people in prison haven't got the range of qualifications that people have on the outside, they still have all the range of intelligence levels. So you kind of establish, you know, what level are we dealing with? Is this someone who's got the aptitude to go into engineering or some high level kind of job that's going to pay them six figures as a salary? And if so, how do we make that happen for them? Because they're much more likely to come out and do that if there's a path towards that. They can see a clear stepping stone. They're going to have a decent living. They can afford to live on the outside, maybe get family back, kids back living with them if they've lost contact. All of these things. Otherwise, you know, they just come out like I described in the book, blinking in the sunlight, what do I do now? Where do I go? And the two extremes couldn't be more different. And as I describe in the book, when you look at the systems, particularly in Scandinavia, the way that they prepare people for release, the first thing that happens on day one of a sentence is, how do we plan for your release? What's the release plan? Whether you're going to be in for 6 months, 5 years, or 10 years, what are we going to do in that time that's going to make you, when you're released, have the best chance in life? And I've never been to prison as a prisoner, but I don't think that's the first thing they do when you go into prison on day one. And it doesn't make sense.
I think going back to that, which is why it's also important to treat, because people will always be like, oh, what does it matter how you get treated or in prison or your conditions and stuff like that. But that very point you're making about planning for your release, you can only do in humane conditions and being treated as a human being. And in your book, you talk about cells being flooded and conditions. I'll tell you some conditions I've seen in prison, which every now and again, Mitchell will, and yourself, you will see the odd picture manages to get released and people can't believe it. But that's every day, especially in a BCAT local, which is where you spend your first time in prison, or if you're back on a sentence. I was a bio cleaner, so I had to go and clean up after people self-harmed or there'd been a fight, which involves putting a white hazmat suit on and going to clean up. But people are left in cells with blood all over the walls. There's shit on the corners of the bed. There's the cell's flooded. The toilet's leaking, which is next to your head. You can smell piss. You can smell shit. The cell's cold. You're not given any clothes because the prison's run out of kit. You're not allowed your own clothes because you've just come into prison. How you're expected then to prepare to change your every way of thinking, your every way you knew as a person, and your beliefs and almost your morals. You can't do that in that environment. I'd challenge anyone to go into that environment and make yourself a better person.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll challenge you to put a dog in that environment and the dog not come out angry and attack people. You know, I mean, never mind human beings. Those conditions are not fit for animals. And you know, most people in this country would, you know, it's amazing, isn't it? When you see there's a story about someone kept their dog in horrible conditions and, you know, they didn't deserve to have a dog and so on. But that's the way we're treating human beings. And we're expecting those human beings not to come out with a bit of resentment, a bit of anger, and quite a lot of dysfunctional sort of thinking and behaviors, because putting people through what you've just described is inhumane. And if you treat people inhumanely, there's a good chance, sadly and tragically, that there's going to be some violence that comes out of that at the other end, or some criminality that comes out at the other end of it. So you're absolutely right. You get out of people in prison what you put in. Yep. And if you put shit in, you get shit out. It's as simple as that. And
then back onto about setting them up for something to do. Now, Mitchell, I'm not going to talk about any prison specifically, because they probably take us off our podcast. But let's just talk about open prison. So this is, forget about the B and C cats where you don't really get an opportunity of finding something. What they give you in open prison is laughable at best. You get sent to go and work in factories or on a production line or in a charity shop for no money. If you do fortunate enough to find yourself in an outside job, which is deemed as a privileged position, once you've done 4 or 5 years of tolerating a lot of shit, you're then taxed 40% of your money before you're taxed again. So even if you're suffering at home and your family are still in debt, which is why, let's have it right, most people that are in prison aren't, there's 10% are murderers and extreme, violent, nasty people. There's a big proportion of people that have just gone to prison because they're trying to survive. They're trying to feed their kids. But then they've got you back in this open condition where you can now have a chance to try and save and to provide something before you get out. They're almost forcing your hand. They're saying to you, well, we're going to take 40% off you, even though we've probably done you for a poker. You've got nothing. We're then going to leave you at a bare minimum, because our view is, why should our officers just about get through and struggle, or people on the outside? Why should you then be able to save, let's talk £2,000, for example, for when you get out? But that makes all the difference to that individual then having to commit crime whilst they're still there, or when they get out, because who wants to
Well,
see
it's a
their
deposit
kids
on a
start
flat.
off?
It's a deposit on a flat, isn't it?
Exactly.
You know, that's the point. And people getting out without even enough money to have somewhere to live. You know, you may as well not even release them in many cases, because the chances of being out for long are pretty slim. And you know, that lack of joined up thinking. I mean, the ingredients that people need to survive in our society, in my view, are you need to have money to live. So you need a job. You need employment, unless you're lucky enough to win the lottery or inherit it. But most people need a job to live. You need somewhere to live. You need a home. And you need people around you. You need like either family, friends, you need a support network of some kind around you, right? If you release people from prison with none of those things, not one of them, they'll be back in prison, as you say, within months, or at the very least within a year or two. And it's just so common sense when you put it like that. How can anybody expect someone who's released to be homeless when they get released? How can that person be? I mean, you can't, getting a job when you don't have anywhere to live, it's impossible. It's completely impossible. And yet we're constantly hearing that we're surprised that this person had only been out a few weeks when they went and committed another burglary. Well, no surprise. It's absolutely predictable, and there's absolutely ways that you could do something about it. And it is very sad. I mean, when you describe those conditions in prison, I mean, the sad thing is there are quite a lot of people out there who go, "So what? You deserve it." And as you say, and that's so short-sighted, and it's so inhumane. It's the same mindset, you know, that you get all of this negative and nasty kind of publicity and commentary around, you know, people, refugees arriving on a boat, you know, children even, you know, oh, just send them back to wherever, send them to Rwanda, you know, all this stuff. And, you know, can you imagine what it takes for a child to try and cross the channel in the winter on a boat at the risk of death? And yet they arrive at the other end and they're told, you know what, we're going to send you to Africa, you know, or somewhere, you know, that you've never been before. You know, it's this sort of just vicious cruelty that people have, which is bad enough in and of itself. But the worst thing of all is the impact it has, the outcomes it creates. The outcomes are so much worse for society and for everyone else, and so much more expensive. I mean, genuinely makes me want to cry when I think about the cost of keeping people in long-term incarceration, in long-term imprisonment. When you look around at, you know, what you could do with that money, you know, if the £50,000 that it to keep one person in prison, 69% of people in prison are non-violent offenders. 69%, and the other 31%, as you say, it's only a small number that have committed a murder or a really serious act of violence. Most of the others are kind of low level, usually fights and stuff like that maybe got out of hand, and you know, that kind of thing. So, but you think about all that money and what you could do with 50 grand just for one primary school. You could buy enough books for the whole primary school for the next 5 years with that money. And you think about literacy in schools, and the school budgets for books have been removed and all the equipment and everything else, but we're still spending all this money on something that actually makes the problem worse. It's just sickening when you think about the sheer waste of human life and the sheer waste of taxpayers' money that goes into the justice system. And I'm just staggered that we don't have a single political party that has the ability to articulate some of this in a way that maybe some people would respond to. But we're just not seeing. We're not seeing it from any of the parties, because
Mitch,
they all do the same thing.
Mitch, do me a favor. Just talk about some of the restrictions and the things put in place for you as IPP, and how, I don't know, how choking that is and how hard that is to navigate your way around not to coming back.
There's been many, and I don't want for 1 minute for it to seem like I want to come across like we shouldn't be punished or I shouldn't be on restrictions. But the common sense approach. I'm just been released 2 months. I'm in a hostel now. Common sense. I'm lucky enough to have a house, missus, and kids. Yet the focus is on ticking a box of me reporting, not to probation or police, because those are things I have to do and I understand. But the focus is on the box tick of, well, you need to go back to the hostel and do a poetry group. And it's the same kind of rhetoric that when we're in DCAT, we're almost like, you'll do as you're told and don't get above your station. How dare you think progressively? So me reporting to a hostel to do a poetry group, along with all these appointments, restrictions, signing in, that has been negative on my family environment. My missus is saying like, well, you're released, but you're not released. Like, is this how it's going to be constantly? Like, I don't see you. You're having to go here, there, and everywhere for, I wouldn't say pointless appointments, because I get the police and probation. But come on, to do a poetry group, I've got two kids.
Mm. Yeah. No, I mean, I get it, and as you say, it's box ticking, but also, you know, all of that interferes with your ability to either get a job or get into something, which, you know, how, so we'll see how you'd even find the time while you're running around between all these different kind of things that they have. When the reality is, what you really need is, you need to reestablish your family life. I'm sure it's very difficult and challenging when you come out for anyone, but to do it with all of that interference, which means that you can't take the time you need to build and reestablish your family connections and kind of rebuild trust with your missus and all the rest of it. But also, you know, you can't focus on what really matters, because in the long run, the only way you're going to stay out of jail is if you get a way of earning a living which is sustainable and can keep you going in whatever that looks like. You can't do that at the moment. And just think about the illogicality of that. You've got someone like yourself, clever. I'm sure you've done education of different kinds when you've been side, as you described, different value to some of that, I'm sure. But you've clearly got all of the ingredients of someone who could take off and do really well in life. But you've just got this ball and chain pulling you back. And that's the system. You should be launching people out of custody into success, not dragging them back towards prison again with every single restriction that they put on people.
Chris, like I say, I understand, but I don't think society like understands the topic we're talking about. I'll give an example. I'm one of the lucky ones to have support, that foundation that you said. Without these foundation blocks, home, money, support, you're heading for a fall. But in my hostel settings now, there's people suffering with real mental health issues, going through the transition of jail 1 minute, banged up like a dog, to you're released into society. And on the surface, it's sold as, well, there's plenty of help. You've got a psychologist there. You've got people that will help you look for a job and sign you on. But there's that glass ceiling. There's no help there for relationship support that your partner now has to deal with. Right, you're back, but is it all roses like we've been dreaming of? No, it's not. That's reality. Another example, the support in the hostel is just a box tick. We can help you do a CV. We can help you sign on. But other than that, you're on your own. We've got a psychologist, but it's a psychologist to talk about relaxation. It's all a box tick that isn't helping many people in the hostel. And they're going to get out after 3 months and say, go on, toddle on, and back into society. And the cycle, a lot of the time, starts again.
I mean, what's the point of you being in a hostel when you've got a home anyway?
Exactly.
I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all, particularly when you think about it in this day and age. And I've written about this as well. And one of the things I talk about at the end of the book is one of the ways in which you can avoid sending so many people to prison is to use technology, because, you know, we've got mobile phones, we've got all manner of ways in which, you know, you could be living at home. You could be equally monitored as regularly as necessary. You've got a tag anyway, but I mean, even the tags, I say, I don't really agree with tags. The point is that you've got a mobile phone, okay, and a mobile phone can track where you are. It can recognize your face, so it can do all of the ingredients that you need. If someone needs to be kept track of because of, you know, they're not going in certain areas or associating with certain people, all of that can be done using a mobile phone nowadays. Now, that's cheap. Now they don't cost very much. Everyone's got them, and the technology would be really straightforward to be able to keep monitoring, and let people carry on their lives otherwise. As it happens, I've got a client at the moment who's bailed, who's allowed to go backwards and forwards to Gibraltar. And every day he's got to stand out there with his phone in front of like one of the landmarks in Gibraltar so they can see where he is. But that's monitored just using a phone once a day. That takes 30 seconds. The rest of the day, he's working, doing all sorts of stuff, just getting on with his life as normal. So you can monitor people without this old-fashioned idea that you have to use hostels, you have to use signing on, you have to keep going to police stations or wherever. None of that is necessary anymore. And not only that, but it's really expensive. It's a complete waste of officer time, because one officer using a mobile phone could monitor 27 people in the time that they'd otherwise spend monitoring one.
Yeah,
and so there's all sorts of kind of technology that you can use to make life easier and to make the journey and the transition smoother, and ultimately to get your time productive rather than wasting it. But the one thing we can all agree on is the criminal justice system is an amazing way of wasting your time. Wasting time with no productive output. That is irrational. It makes no sense, and it needs to change.
Go on.
Just have to get off. I've always thought this, and reading Chris's book, the social aspect of things, it jumped out at me, like what I lived through. Our prison reflects society and vice versa. If you look at Norway, they're progressive and they work on genuinely, you've committed your crime, but how do we work this better so you're a productive member of society? And there's a chapter in Chris's book, I don't know which one it is, sorry, where you speak about personal morality.
It's the last chapter, yeah.
Explain that for our listeners, and just like on the back of my opinion, the reason I say prison reflects society, because the social aspect regarding the state's agendas, is prison for punishment? Does it really work? These are all subjects that I think fall into personal morality, and people don't know about that. Maybe I'm a bit confused on it.
No, well, I think my perspective on it was that one of the real problems with the way in which, as a society, we talk about and think about criminal justice is we talk about people being good or bad. We often get headlines about, evil monster did this, or, and these kind of words. It's not whether we're describing not the thing that someone did. So in other words, committing a burglary, okay, it's obviously not a good thing, and it's extremely damaging to the victims who have their things stolen and their home invaded, etc. But to describe someone as an evil burglar, for example, now that I have a problem with, because once you if you are looking to put people, everybody is either good or evil. They're one or the other, according to this analysis. And my view is that that's where we go wrong, is that instead of looking at the fact that really anybody in adverse circumstances, and particularly adverse childhood circumstances, anybody could end up committing a crime. I mean, anybody that was, for example, beaten as a child in the care system, given no access to decent education, and introduced to drugs at the age of 9 or 10, whoever they are and wherever they came from, you put someone through that process, the chances are they're going to end up in the criminal justice system at some point for committing an offence of some kind. Not everyone, but many people. And likewise, if you take those who have been through the system like you guys, and if you give them every advantage in terms of, welfare, education, love, care, support, money, and kind of career support and encouragement through really good schools and everything else, the chances are that very few people who went through that would end up in prison. And so my view is, well, they're the same people. It's the same people. It's exactly the same people. It's just that with different life experiences, and particularly with different adverse childhood experiences. And so the way in which I end up in the book is that really, it's an artificial and unhelpful way to look at the human condition, to talk about one group of bad people and another group of good people, that most people say, well, I'm one of the good people, I would never do that. It's very easy to say that if you haven't had any of those traumas which tend to characterize the experience of people in the criminal justice system. I just don't believe it. Not only do I not believe that a person who commits a crime is evil or bad, they've done a bad thing maybe in many cases, truly awful thing, or relatively small number in fact. But there are always reasons and explanations for that, which are not just that they were born that way. I just don't buy that, and I don't think science supports the idea that people are born that way, other than a tiny, tiny number of sociopaths and psychopaths who end up, as serial killers and repeatedly murdering children and so on. But they're one in 1,000 of the prison population, or 1 in 10,000 is actually in that category. Tiny, tiny number. Well, there's only 70 doing a whole life tariff. So that tells you 70 out of 80,000 prisoners are in the category that's considered so bad they can never be released. So, but even with those people, when you analyze each of those, many of them, massive trauma, head injury, severe psychosis and psychotic illnesses. So none of those things kind of take away from the crimes they commit. But what it does is explain that when you stop back and you stop saying they're different to us and actually saying people in prison are just the same as us, it's just a different way in which their life has turned out, but their future potential is equally the same, and we need to tap into that. And the other thing that's linked to that point about that you could stop putting people in boxes is that much of the commentary you hear around criminal justice is punishment. What's the correct punishment for the crime? Now, punishment is something that was invented thousands of years ago at a time when we really had no kind of sophisticated understanding of how human beings work. But we're still addicted to this idea of punishing bad people for doing wrong. That, in my mind, is a lot of the reason we go wrong. Because if that's what you're trying to achieve, if your principal objective in the criminal justice system is to punish people for doing wrong because they're bad people, the consequence is that you will end up with policies that don't work, because you're going to have an ever-escalating prison population, an ever-increasing number of people in prison, and for an ever longer period of time. And so what you think you want, which is punishment of bad people, turns out to be the thing that creates more crime and often creates a crime wave in a society. So once you strip the emotion away, you stop to he's a bad or a person and she's a really good person, and you realize that everybody's pretty much the same when they're born. It's just that different things happen to them along the way. Then you can start looking at, okay, let's depersonalize it, and let's just look at what's the best way to get the group of people who find themselves in trouble with the police out the other end of a process, whatever that looks like, so that they can get on with their lives and live their life in a lawful way with their families, in employment, but with all the problems and things. It doesn't matter what walk of life you're from. You've got divorce, you've got all sorts of, financial problems. These things happen. It's part of life, but you have to give everybody the tools and the skills to navigate that without bouncing backwards and forwards from prison. And I've never met anyone, even people who have committed the most atrocious murders, I've never sat with them and I thought, you know what, there's something that you're different, like species to me. I always feel that we're all the same. And yet I just read so much and hear so much of people who just talk about those in prison, even the most damaged people. And you guys have come across them, I'm sure, many, many times. The most extraordinarily damaged people who spent their entire childhoods being beaten black and blue and abused and all this kind of stuff. And yet it doesn't matter what the background. There's a group of people out in society, a large number of people who just think they're just terrible, awful people. We just need to lock them up and throw away the key. Until we can get people to kind of and listen to voices like yours. I mean, I'd love you guys to get out there. I hopefully can make some introductions, because I'd love to get you two guys onto some of the big radio programs, some of the big TV stuff, because people hearing the way that your intelligence and your empathy and your passion for your own lives, but also for trying to support other people through these processes, I think it's really powerful. And I think the more people hear real lived experience, the better.
Well, Chris, that's nice of you to say, and we'd both happily take you up on it. I think you put that last sort of comment, and I think you said it really nicely, to be honest with you. And it's nice to hear, and I hope some people that have the opposite opinion to us all here take some of that on board and think about it logically. And like you said, take the emotion out of it. I suppose before we finish, we've asked all our guests, and this is the last of this series. So thank you. You've brought our series to a nice end. Is one piece of advice you would give to someone, and not just anyone, people that are maybe caught up in that life, whether that be crime, robberies, violence, that are on their way to a prison sentence, or that have just left prison and are contemplating what fork are they going to go down now? What road are they choosing? Are they going to go back to the easy way and a quick buck, or are they going to go down a long way? One piece of advice through your system, through your experiences, what would you say to them if you could only say one thing?
I think.
Sorry.
Yeah, is it both of us or each of us? Which of us?
I'll go for you first, Chris.
Okay, well, I think, I've obviously got the perspective of having watched those journeys, and sadly, over 30 years, some of those journeys have just largely ended up with people staying in prison, and others have, gone away from prison. I think the only thing I would say is that in the end, whatever you've done in the past, if you apply yourself to looking after yourself mentally, looking after yourself in terms of education, and looking after yourself in terms of employment, those three things, and also be kind to the people around you that matter to you, because ultimately they will make a big difference. If you achieve those things, you have every chance that in a year or 2 or 3, the experience of the criminal justice system will be in your rearview mirror. But if you let yourself down in any of those ways, there's a good chance that you'll end up back in prison, and you have to make a choice.
And Mitch, yourself?
I couldn't have put it more eloquently. I'll just put it from my perspective. We sit in prison and we pine about our family, how we're going to do right by them, etc., etc. And it's so easy to get out and fall back into your old ways and not become, and almost forget to be content with what you were thinking about in prison. World doesn't for anybody, but if I could give any bit of advice, stick to your goals, be content like you were in prison. Those thoughts, what you thought about just wanting to go to the fridge, wanting to wake up next to your missus, sometimes when you're out, you forget about that train of thought. And be patient, like Chris said. If you're on a goal and you're really trying to achieve it, he hit it on the head earlier. Prison is full of bright sparks, stupid people, mix of society. But stick to your goals, and time and a bit of luck hopefully will let you achieve them.
Yeah. Chris, I just want to
do everything overnight. There's no get rich quick schemes out there, and anyone who tells you that there is isn't telling you the whole picture. And it does take a bit of time, but it's worth it.
Chappy, I have to get in on the back of what from Chris's experience. He's made a living off representing prisoners, people like me. There aren't many success stories. You hear about it on the news and you see the watches, see the bling and the holidays. But realistically, we all know that it comes to an end in some way. And it not only the people around you. So I guess it's kind of being realistic and asking yourself, what's the longevity of the criminality that I'm doing? Where do I get off and when does it end?
Well, on average, sadly, it ends in premature death for many, if not most, and that's another thinking point, I think, for people. But like I say the same thing I say to kids when I speak to them in schools. It's what you make of it. You make choices. Everyone has to make choices. And I think it's important to know that no one's going to hand you anything on a plate. I mean, that's a fact. You are going to have to do it for yourself, and it's going to be really, really hard a lot of the time, which is why keeping that family network around you and your friends who are not sort of in the system, if you like, if you've got friends who are out there working and sort of bringing up families, they're your network. Stick with those people and try and, move away from people where there's going to be temptation.
I think as well, on a closing comment, Mitch, I'll leave it on. I read a book. I haven't read many books. Well, me and Mitch are both studying degrees, but in terms of enjoying books, I've never been a big reader. But of the few books I've read, one of them being yours. When I first got sentenced, I read The Chimp Paradox by Dr. Stephen Peters. Don't know if you come across it. Yeah. And the thing that's ever stuck with me since is the definition of insanity. of repeating the same thing and expecting a different outcome. Unless you're prepared to change something, you're not gonna get a different outcome. I used to try and stop drinking every week, but I wouldn't change anything within that week apart from telling myself I'm not gonna drink on Friday. Get to Friday, and I was out till Saturday morning again. So I think I'd like to just tell people, just try something different, change someone in your friendship circle, just try anything different, whatever that may be, and you might get a different outcome. And I think
also listen to people who deserve to be listened to, because a lot of the time, we whoever we are, you often listen to the wrong people. But if you think about it, you've got in your life, most people, and I accept not everyone, but most people have someone, whether it's a partner or a parent or an older friend perhaps, or someone who's done all right for themselves, they have someone in their kind of life that you can look at and think, this person's actually knows what they're talking about, and they've made something of themselves, and they're actually got a good idea of how to live their life. Listen to those people. Yeah, if your missus is telling you you've been out 3 nights running, et cetera, and actually the kids are really unhappy, you listen to people who actually have a really good kind of reason to care about you and want good things for you. Listen to those people. Don't listen to people that want something from you. Because those people haven't got your best interests at heart.
Yeah, Chris, agreed. And I just want to say again, thank you. You've come across. I don't know what I pictured originally, but I think you just saying about being kind. You come across. Hopefully, I'm not going to read something crazy about you in the future, but you come across as really kind, genuine. You've done this with no fees, no expenses. We're a not-for-profit charity, so it's much appreciated. And thank you again.
You're welcome. Keep it up, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And we'll be in touch.
Take care. Have a good afternoon.
And yourself. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Mental Health Injustice podcast. We'll see you next week.